Yeah, I'm Will Stahl-Timmins. My background is very firmly in the top left-hand corner of Alan's Venn diagram in the designer section. My background, I started as a graphic designer, but I've been moving slowly down towards the data and the development side, working with people in those areas. So that will give you a sense of where I'm coming from in this. But unashamedly, we're in the design section. If you really want to ask me some difficult questions about statistics later, you can do that if you like the idea of seeing me looking slightly uncomfortable. But I'm going to stick to mostly talking about design today. And I've been really pleased to see that there have been so many talks here about visualizing data. It's great to see that there's generally an explosion of that. I'm not going to go too much into the background of why you're going to visualize data because of that. I think it's nice to see that largely a lot of you really get visualizing data. It's a great way of. I think there's so many people in this room who have fascinating data, and they really want to be able to get that data and in a conversation with somebody else, get across why it's so interesting quickly using visualization techniques, or analyze your own data and explore it by using visual techniques. So I won't dwell too much on the reasons for visualizing, which is quite a nice position to be in, I think, for me. So what I will talk about, and also I don't have I'm not going to be really nicely prepared like Alan was earlier with a slide ready about what tools I'm going to use, because I'm not going to talk about particular tools for presenting data. I'm going to talk about principles of visualizing data, because I think I don't really mind what tools people use. If you're comfortable with using Excel and the tools that are in there, and you can use them appropriately, that's brilliant. If you want to design things from scratch using Illustrator, I use a lot of Adobe Creative Suite applications. I use a couple of programming languages. I'm not a brilliant programmer, but I use a bit of processing and stuff like that for larger sets of data. That's great. And I've been teaching some students recently who actually really got into using bits of string to visualize data in different colors and different lengths. That was great as well. Whatever you're using, that's absolutely fine. So what I'm going to do is I'll talk briefly about the work that I do at the European Centre for Environment and Human Health, but then I'm going to show some examples of historical information graphics that I think show some of these principles of design and visualizing data. And also, I know it's been a very long day, so hopefully it'll be a kind of bit of a light relief in a sense, just to look at some nice examples of graphics, and we'll do that. So, European Centre for Environment and Human Health, the work that I do there. As I say, I'm a designer. The European Centre for Environment and Human Health is at Exeter Medical School, and it's a very multidisciplinary team of scientists, from social scientists to natural chemists, toxicologists, looking at the interconnections between the environment and health. So that's the sort of general doom and gloom stuff, the bad things the environment does to us. Climate change is going to destroy our health, and pollution is a real problem, but also the positive benefits of spending time in the natural environment as well, and healthy workplaces. And I work across all of those themes, although I tend to work more in the doom and gloom aspect. I don't quite know what that says about my personality, but for some reason that's what I end up doing. And basically what I find myself doing a lot of the time, the European Centre for Environment and Human Health there, basically what I find myself doing a lot of the time is dealing with what I call excited scientist syndrome. And this is a classic case of excited scientist syndrome, the symptoms of which generally involve perspiring gently and spewing data. But this is, I'm sure she won't mind me saying this is Dr. Claire Redshaw, who works at the centre, who's a toxicologist, and she'd come across this really interesting relationship, and she came to me and said, look, this fantastic data set. This is about a quarter of the data that she showed me. This is one of the 4 tables that she gave me. And on the left-hand side, she was like, wow, look at this, we've got these illnesses. And we know that climate change is going to affect the prevalence of these different disease patterns. And we also know what kind of medications are used to treat those, so we can see what impact climate change is going to have on pharmaceutical use. And that will produce some brilliant outputs for all sorts of people that need to deal with this. Wastewater treatment companies and pharmaceutical companies will be really interested in this data. So I kind of looked at it and went, well, that's very interesting, Claire. I've got some of these are repeated. We've got the cold temperatures, so there's about three things caused by cold temperatures. And then some of these medications are repeated. We've got antibiotics down here, and they seem to be for this as well. But I can't really get an overview of that data. I can't really see what that data is telling me. So we reimagined this, and I'm going to go for a step here that actually took a couple of months, and lots of going backwards and forwards and discussing and things like that in the press of a button. But what we ended up with was this. And this is a different way of presenting that data. So around the outside now we have the 5 different climatic conditions. You can now see that there are 5 different climatic conditions: lack of water, cold temperatures, air allergens, floods, and sun exposure. The health conditions are then within that. So you can see cold temperatures lead to respiratory infections, cardiovascular disease. And then in the very centre we have all the different pharmaceuticals that are used to treat those conditions. And the size of the bubbles in the centre relate to the number of conditions that are treated by that. And you start to be able to see a couple of things now that are more difficult to pick out of the table. Firstly, simply because of the size of the bubbles, you can see that the antibiotics are really going to be used more often because of a number of different causes there. But also you get to see, because of the colours, you get to see which climatic conditions are going to be responsible for those things, and then you can start to relate that to the uncertainty in those, and start to build up a picture. So you can see that the cold temperatures are a larger driver than, for example, the sun exposure. So we're quite interested in these kind of techniques of visualizing data, and it's interesting to see that a lot of the work at the moment we've seen so far today has been on how to communicate this with a sort of general public audience. We're really looking at how do we analyze our data ourselves, and how do we get that sort of expert community talking about this. And I think the same principles in a lot of ways apply. Here's another information graphic that we recently designed to look at pharmaceutical transport. So that one was about which ones are going to be used. This is about how pharmaceuticals get from manufacture through to people, through their use of those products through their bodies, into the toilet, disposal through the sink, household waste, and through that into the environment, and then back again to people through crops and through water. And the reason we wanted to create this diagram, this was more of a sort of general public themed one, was because it's a very complex system, and we wanted to use a familiar visual metaphor. So we used the metaphor of a town here to show how people are actually part of this system. People at home, medical professionals, pharmaceutical companies all have a part to play in this kind of system. We're quite chuffed with the success of this one. It actually ended up winning a prize in the National Science Foundation Visualisation competition in the States, and ended up being published in Science earlier in the year, and we've got some really good responses from that. And so I think it's a real sign that people are beginning to see, well, actually, if we visualise this data, people are starting to actually pick up on it more and relate to it, and can actually see what's happening, rather than a series of boxes and arrows, which is what this kind of diagram is traditionally presented with. Another example of excited scientist syndrome here from Dr. Ben Wheeler, which is concerns the distance from the coast and people's self-reported health in the census data from the UK. And in this case, yeah, again, he was going to look at this brilliant relationship. I've got 2 bar charts and a map and a load of data. What shall I do with it? How do I present this? Oh, and it needs to be presented in an A4 page. Actually, and all the text needs to be on the A4 page as well, so it needs to be about that big. So we had a look at this and went through it a few different ways. I'll take you through this a bit more of the journey of this one, because I think that there's a couple of lessons in that. So first of all, I just tried synthesizing the data. I wasn't quite happy about these bar charts up here. What we're actually measuring here is mean values and a 95% confidence interval there. And I wasn't really happy with that being presented as a bar. A bar to me represents a quantity. So I started changing them into this form, which I think is a little bit easier to grasp as a point rather than a quantity of self-reported mean health. And put on a key for the map so that you can actually see what he was looking at here. There's a couple of things I wasn't quite happy about here. Is we're looking at the distance from the coast. So each of these bars represents a distance from the coast. in the UK, but actually the categories aren't constant. So the largest category is actually takes up 30 kilometres, the next category takes up 15, the next one takes up 5, and this last one is only 1. So I wanted to get some sense of that onto the map, which is actually quite hard to see when you're looking at the map overall. So sort of putting in a scale so that you can sort of start to see the difference between those things, I thought was helpful, and putting the data points actually in that order would be helpful as well. So that gave us this. We had the sort of, the actual distance on there, the actual distance on there, we had the map on there, and it was separated by various different things. I wasn't happy. I went back to them and talked through them with this. I still wasn't happy for a couple of reasons. The data here was to be presented in an international journal. And I think you really have to bear in mind your audience when you're talking about data visualization. And this does rely on one piece of knowledge, which we probably all here possess, but an international audience may not, which is that this represents the UK. At a glance, if you don't know the shape of, not even the UK, this represents England. And if you don't know the shape of England, particularly without Wales and Scotland providing its identity, that's going to be a little bit hard to interpret. So we went back to the drawing board at this stage, and I thought, well, what's the best way of saying this relationship between the coast and health? So we thought a side view, we actually see the sea, you see people living at different scales along that. That would be a better way of presenting that information and give you what we were looking for is something that showed you what that data says without you having to actually read through much of it, but to give you an instant kind of view of what was happening. Unfortunately, I imagined this lovely little curve. When I actually looked at the side view data and looked at what 50 kilometres looked like and looked at the highest mountain in England, which is just under a kilometre high, you get this very flat line here, and the sea goes down to about 300 metres at the end there. And those trees will probably be about 5 kilometres high on there. So it's a really difficult balance to strike. We've already been talking a bit about making a balance between visual communication and accuracy, and it is a difficult balance to strike. This, we could put some data on top of that, but it didn't give that kind of initial glance, at a glance, what is this information about look. So we went back to the drawing board again and added the trees back in. 5 kilometre high trees they may be, and also changed the representation of a sea to something much more sort of graphical, much more so symbolic, I suppose, representation there. So what we've got here is really, and there's one more version which brings in a line for the coast and then relates that back down to the data there. So you can see that there's actually, puts in the baseline group and the distance between those. But what we've got here is kind of a balance between the sort of accuracy, but also giving that signposting clue as to what the data is about. The fact that it's to do with the coast and where people live in relation to it. So a lot of steps, but and then one more example before I move on. This is a slightly more technical document. This is actually made not for publication, but for decision makers at NICE. This is health data about different medical trials. They have to deal with a large volume of data. So during my PhD, I had a look at how to present that visually rather than using large tables, so that people could. And we did a lot of sort of evaluation work. I put this one in because I sort of wanted to just draw your attention to the fact that a lot of the work that that I do at the European Centre and a lot of the work I do in research is about looking at different ways of presenting information and comparing this to traditional data tables. It seemed to really reduce the amount of time that it took for people to look through information, and also increase the accuracy with which they could pick out data from those. So I promised you some historical information graphics and some lessons to learn from those. And I'll go back. I'll start with this guy, René Descartes, and the Cartesian coordinates that he is so famous for developing. I think were a really important aspect of starting to develop these ways of presenting information graphics. And that's because, not necessarily because what he was doing was trying to present a way of making a mathematical formula to describe a real-world object, but because about 100 years later, you get guys like William Playfair. We've already seen in Alan's slides earlier an introduction from his thing, but you get these people thinking, well, what happens if we do it what happens if we do this the other way around? What happens if we what happens if actually we use the reverse of that and represent and use the mathematical formula to represent the numerical data? What happens if it's the other way around? And from that you get this brilliant idea of representing numbers using visual quantities. And William Playfair had to fight for that idea of representing time in a linear manner, and for representing data using blocks of objects in these sort of two dimensions that we've got here. So this was a very, very early example of a bar chart. And William Playfair was a Scottish economist who realised that this technique you could actually use to find patterns like this. So you can actually start to see, instead of just having tabulated data, it seems much easier for your eye to pick it out if you're just sort of working along there and find the patterns within those. And I think the real genius of using visualization techniques is about something really that we learn from a very early age. If you have a sort of piece of cake and you cut it into slices, it's kind of amazing that you can pick out which one of those slices is one of the largest ones. It's a really complex calculation to do, but we can all do it. We know which one is roughly going to be the biggest one. And it's an odd shape, and you can really calculate that. It's because your eye is doing that visual processing without you even having to think about it. You can compare the objects of two different area of objects, two different sizes of objects, very, very easily, because by relying on this visual processing system that we could use to calculate the speed of objects, the distance of objects from us, whether things are a threat to us or not. Even those things can be used by the skilled information designer. I've got to have an example from health in here, and you may recognise this one. Anyone? Yeah. Oh, I've actually put it on there, haven't I? What am I doing? I normally hide those things away when I've got notes, but I'm using a different system today. So yeah, John Snow, the cholera epidemic of 1854. The story goes, cholera epidemic in this particular part of London around Broad Street, and John Snow plotted these things on a map, and then he realised that the pump here in the middle of Broad Street was right in the centre of all the cases, removed the handle, and the town was saved. I'm not quite sure I buy into that. I actually believe the map came after the saving of the people. But there is one really important thing about this, which is that that would be really hard data to interpret if you looked at a list of addresses. And he may well have had that. I mean, he had his own theories about the dominant theory of the day was that it was a miasma that was causing it, and he was cynical about that. And he had other reasons to believe that it would be this pump handle would have this effect. But looking at a huge list of addresses, even if they were organised in terms of their distance from the different pumps, would be really hard to interpret. Looking at that at a glance, you get an overview of it, you can see where the centre is. It's because your eyes are doing that processing work for you. Not just your eyes, your visual processing system, sort of on a very basic level. Another example from house, and I mean, it's fascinating that all of these things are happening roughly the same time. 1854 is the cholera epidemic. 1853 to 1856 is the Crimean War, and we've got Florence Nightingale doing her bit then as well, which she's quite well known for this, developing this rose diagram to show that the causes of death in the Crimea weren't necessarily from wounds, but largely from preventable diseases in the blue here. I should just note that on this diagram, which shows the time passing here and the relative quantities, Florence Nightingale actually distorted the data quite a lot by using this technique of a rose diagram, where all of the data stems from a certain central point. So the further away from that central point you go, the wider this thing becomes. If she'd used the area, as it suggests in here, she says area quite a number of times in here, but actually what she's done is just calculate the distance from the centre, thus accentuating her point. So I don't know if that served her very well in the end. I think a lot of people have sort of started to realise that was not necessarily the wisest way of presenting that data. I think it shows you've got to be really careful about that human visual processing system. Our eyes automatically calculate area, therefore it accentuates these larger pies rather than a distance from the centre. You'll probably recognise this one as well, Charles Joseph Minard. Those of you who know Edward Tufte's work, he often uses this as an example. And it is a great visualisation. The idea was that it started with looking at Napoleon's march to Moscow and subsequent retreat. And the visual technique that he introduces here is the width of this line is proportional to the number of troops remaining. So it starts out here at the Rhine with a massive force pushing through towards Moscow, branching off here and here, and then it shows the disastrous loss of life on the retreat there, and you get a real sense of that sort of quantity loss of human life much more clearly, I think, than you would just seeing the numbers presented. But also you get to see the position of the army, you get to see where they meet up, you get to see the direction of travel, and down here you have a link to the temperature on the return journey, which starts to explain some of that horrible loss of life. So a slightly more cheery example, this is one that, and I will finish up in the next couple of slides, this is the last example I have of a historical information graphic, but we're moving forward quite a bit now. But this are a couple called Otto and Marie Neurath, who were working in Vienna from sort of around the 30s, I believe. And they had this system called Isotype, which stands for International System of Typographic Picture Education. They were really looking at how to present statistical data to audiences with very low literacy. They were working in Russia and also did quite a lot of work in Nigeria. And their general principle was to try and represent things rather than with numerical quantities, actually represent them with the thing that they're counting. Here, this is a number of cars produced in different places around the world, and I really recommend looking at them. They've got some really developed a lot of the rules for this technique of how to present data in this manner using icon diagrams. Okay, so that's all the examples I have. 4 people that, if you're interested in learning more about information visualization, you should check out their work, which I'll just skim straight through, and then that's it. Edward Tufte, I don't always agree with. He's a statistician by background, and I couldn't really do a presentation like this without mentioning him, but he does have some very useful principles for starting to design information graphics. David McCandless, background in journalism. He really knows how to tell a story. The techniques he uses for visualization are often quite simple, just almost comparing data using lines or comparative sizes. But he really knows how to pick good data to present timely, relevant data. His book's good, his website's good, and another one to look at. Hans Rosling, you may well have come across him. He's a Swedish statistician, and he has this thing called the Gapminder project. This is a static example of it, but he does a lot of motion graphics. This shows the relationship between income, life expectancy, country size, and time. In the motion version of this, he actually animates it, so you can see them all changing through the years, and that's really worth checking out if you haven't looked at it. And the last one, Ben Fry, you might well have heard of him. He's developed this language called processing as part of his studies at MIT, which is really geared around visualizing data. So 4 people to look at, and I really applaud everyone for their efforts at visualizing data that we've already seen here today. If you'd like to know anything more about it, please do get in touch. You can get in touch with me through my email address or follow me on Twitter. I promise that I do not tweet what I had for breakfast, but only relevant information graphic related stuff. Thank you very much.